Okay, this is the Railroad Revolution, Objective 1, about how the railroad industry contributed to the post-Civil War industrial revolution in America. And we're going to start just with a look back real quick at the pre-Civil War railroad age and how this all got started in the first place. The first railroad appeared in 1828. And the major reason that railroads started to appear is that they were faster and more reliable than canals. Cheaper to produce, and they could go anywhere, and they didn't freeze over in the winter. Whereas with the rivers, you kind of depended on where they went, and with the canals, it kind of depended on where they could be built. Well, railroads were a whole lot cheaper and could go anywhere and didn't freeze in the wintertime because they weren't water. So that was the main reason that people wanted to form railroads in the first place. Now, the railroad revolution before the Civil War is mostly in the north. As you can see from the chart here, most of the lines are in the northern parts here, and there were 35,000 miles of track by the Civil War in the north, and this is key, all east of the Mississippi River. There wasn't a single railroad line that went west of the Mississippi. However, the railroad revolution faced quite a few obstacles. The first one was that those who had invested in canals and roads opposed it. In 1833, New York State even went so far as to forbid railroads to carry freight, and that was so the Erie Canal would be able to keep the freight business in upstate New York. That didn't last really long, and people started really investing heavily in railroads. But some of the other obstacles had to do with safety. Many of them, or many people in America, considered railroads to be extremely unsafe. The brakes were bad. It was not uncommon for you to pull into a station, put the brakes on, and go sailing right past the station, then put it in reverse, and while reversing backward to get to the station, put the brakes on again and miss that mark as well. So the brakes were considered bad. There were a lot of accidents. If you applied the brakes, flying sparks might set fire to any haystacks, houses, or buildings that were nearby because the houses and the buildings were made of wood. And also there were no uniform track widths, and that caused a series of delays. If you were going from, say, New York City to Charlotte, North Carolina, or something like that, you might have to stop at a different line along the way about 6 or 7 times. And because there was no uniform track width, a train going from New York to Philadelphia might have to unload all of its passengers and cargo and put them on a new train that goes from Philadelphia to Baltimore, because the first line might have been, let's say, 4.5 meters, and the next one might be 4.75 meters in terms of its track width. So because the track width was different from place to place and from line to line, it caused a lot of delays just unloading stock and passengers and goods and putting them onto new trains just to have to be unloaded again in a little bit. One passenger reported one time going from Boston to Washington, I think it was, and having to stop 7 times and get on 7 different trains along the way. Eventually the track widths were standardized to solve the problem, but prior to the Civil War it was a pretty big issue. Now if you take a look at the chart here, getting into the post-Civil War railroad age from 1865 to 1900, we basically dominate. Now this chart is in kilometers, but basically in miles. By 1900, if you look at the chart there up at the top, we basically have around 200,000 miles of railroad track covering all of America. The next highest in the world is Germany with roughly 40,000 kilometers, and then the next one after that is Canada with about 17,000 miles or 21,000 kilometers. Basically, if there was railroad track in the world, we were the ones that were dominating it. And there was no railroad that captured the public's imagination more than the idea of a transcontinental railroad, or a railroad across the continent. Now, as you can see in the picture here, this is the Transcontinental Railroad, starting from one side in Omaha, Nebraska, and working its way to the west, and another one starting in Sacramento, California, and working its way to the east, eventually connecting here at Promontory Point, Utah, on the Great Salt Lake. Now, the thing is that this obviously doesn't go across the country, but you had a bunch of existing rail lines all the way over in this area here that had been in place since before the Civil War. So the idea was, once you built this line and connected it with the existing lines, you would have a railroad that went across the country. Now, overall, this was going to be a pretty good deal for the railroad companies that were contracted to do it. As you can see here, starting in Omaha, Nebraska, this is the Union Pacific that's working its way to the west, and the Central Pacific, which was working its way to the east. These were the two main companies that the government decided they were going to hire for the job. And if you can see red buffer areas on either side. And if you look at this section right down here, it's 1 square mile held by the government or sold in kind of a checkerboard pattern, 100 yards on either side of the track that was built. For each mile of track built, a company would receive 20 square miles of land on either side of the track. And they'd also get a hefty payment for each mile of track built. If it was flat land, then you'd get $16,000. If you had to go through mountains, it was $48,000. Pretty good sum for the day. Now, as you can see here, the Union Pacific started in Omaha, Nebraska, and worked its way once again toward the west, all the way to Promontory Point here. The Central Pacific is working its way to the east. Now, in terms of who got to have the most money, it's kind of hard to figure out, but when it's all said and done, the Union Pacific is the one that eventually builds more miles of track, a little over 1,000. The Central Pacific built about half of that. But if you take a look at the elevation, the Central Pacific had a bigger challenge, and the Union Pacific had more advantages, really, because they were going along flat land all along here. This was in Omaha, and then eventually by the time they hit what is today Kearney, Nebraska, North Platte, Nebraska, Sidney, Nebraska, as they get into Wyoming to Cheyenne and Laramie and places like that, they started to deal with the mountains more, but in the beginning they were just cruising along on flat land. The Central Pacific, meanwhile, started in Sacramento and had to deal with the Sierra Nevada mountains right off the bat. This is the elevation in Reno, Nevada, and different places along the way, but they had to get over the mountain range pretty much right away. Now, that really frustrated a couple of people who were running the Central Pacific Railroad, because in some cases they were only managing to go 2 inches a day. But in any event, taking a look at these two, if you look here along these railroad towns, the Union Pacific is made up primarily of Irish and newly freed slaves, freedmen, eventually by the end of the Civil War, even though construction started before that. The Central Pacific, moving eastward from Sacramento once again, is mostly Chinese labor, and this was a pretty dangerous job because to get through these mountains that were here, it often involved dynamite for the tunnels. Like I said, they could only go about inches per day due to the mountains, and one interesting point is that the Big Four that financed this project for the Central Pacific was led by a California governor named Leland Stanford. Leland Stanford, of course, would eventually start Stanford University. Now, the conditions for the Transcontinental Railroad were not easy by any stretch of the imagination. You obviously had to deal with the environmental concerns of the weather and the difficulties dealing with the snow and things like that as you were trying to build. Here's a portrait of the Central Pacific. You can see the Chinese workers over here on the side. Central Pacific making its way toward the east. And the Union Pacific once again making its way toward the west. But no matter which side you were on, Union Pacific or Central Pacific, you had to deal with numerous other environmental conditions that made it pretty difficult. For example, building a bridge like this, just the general engineering of which would have been phenomenal for 1860s technology to get across a gorge or a valley or anything along those lines. That also made the conditions tremendously difficult. But regardless of the weather conditions and everything along those lines, they eventually do get the construction done in 1869 with the two lines finally meeting at Promontory Point, Utah on the northern edge of the Great Salt Lake, as you saw in some of the slides before. Now, the workers themselves had to live in a tented town called Hell on Wheels that continually moved with the construction. Hell on Wheels was a pretty rough place to live when you think about it. It provided everything that a worker would want: gambling, saloons, prostitutes, and also a church. But there were other things they had to deal with as well. Native Americans were not real keen on the idea of railroads being built through their territory, so many lives were lost in Native American attacks during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And it wasn't always easy on towns either. If the Transcontinental Railroad happened to be heading toward your particular town, then it could turn into a booming city, just like Cheyenne, Wyoming here by 1882. Things would flourish, permanent buildings would be set up, and small villages, small towns, plots of land waiting to be developed could turn any village into a proper big town. But if the Transcontinental Railroad was not coming to your town and you were off the beaten path that everybody was traveling by taking the quote-unquote Iron Horse West, well, then there was a real possibility that your town could become a ghost town. Now, there were a couple of other lines that followed the Transcontinental Railroad out west. Once the original railroad is built and people are going west and making their way out there to start businesses and settle and things like that, a couple of lines were developed in the 1880s and 1890s that also added to the American dream out west. The first is the Northern Pacific Railroad, which, as you can see here, runs from Lake Superior to Puget Sound, Washington. The next one is the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, which was developed in 1884, a year after the Northern Pacific Railroad, and covered most of the American Southwest. And also the Southern Pacific, which started in New Orleans, Louisiana, making its way along the southern rim of the American Southwest, eventually going up to San Francisco and past, even getting as far as Portland, Oregon eventually. And the Great Northern Railroad, which ran from Minnesota to Washington State, developed in 1893 by one of the great railroad men of the time, a guy named James J. Hill. So that's basically how the railroad industry contributed to the post-Civil War industrial revolution in America with the Transcontinental Railroad and everything else. And now we're going to get into, in Objective 2, Cornelius Vanderbilt and the influence that he has on things as they proceed ahead.